thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General Hart, for taking time out in your early evening to have a conversation with us about climate change. Just to remind our participants, the format for tonight's program will be initially a conversation between ASG Hart and myself. Later on, we will open up the floor to questions and comments, and you can put those in the chat at any point, and then Diana will call on you later on. So you don't need to hold your questions. We will hold them for you. Mr. Hart, welcome to Fairleigh Dickinson University. Under non-COVID circumstances, you would probably still be sitting in traffic right now en route from the UN over the George Washington Bridge to one of our campuses. I hope that sometime in the future you will be able to make that trip. But in the meantime, I am very happy to see you. And I'd like to begin our conversation really by asking you to tell us something about yourself. You have been working in the field of diplomacy and public affairs for close to 3 decades. And I'm wondering when and how you came to make climate change your signature issue. And you're on mute.
Sorry, it wasn't allowing me to unmute myself. Finally got it figured out. Thank you so much. It's really great to spend this evening with you and your team at Fairleigh Dickinson University. And I was a diplomat for Barbados. It's my first calling, and I was posted to our mission to the United Nations in the early 2000s. And I was assigned the second committee, and at the UN, it's the committee that handles issues related, economic issues and sustainable development issues, including climate change. And I was tasked with the responsibility of negotiating a sustainable development program for small island developing states. And Barbados is a small island developing states, and we have a group of about 40 odd small island developing states, and we coordinate on all of these issues. And one of the elements of that program of action was climate change. There were many other elements, desertification, biodiversity, energy, oceans, etc. But one of those elements was climate change. And it was the first time that I had started to negotiate climate change. It's like the early 2000s. And during those negotiations, I'll be very honest, we were clobbered. The larger countries were a lot more prepared. They knew what the issues were, where were some of the pitfalls, etc. And we were absolutely clobbered. And I, my competitive spirited person in me decided that that would never happen again. So that summer, I went to Barbados. I sat at the feet of a really world-renowned Barbadian climate scientist, Dr. Leonard Nurse, and I got my teaching in climate. And the more that I learned about it, the more he taught me, the more I realized that it was not only a scientific issue or an environmental issue, that this was an issue that represented an existential threat, the preeminent existential threat to the survival of small island developing states. And therefore, I developed a passion. I started to do a lot more, and then I started to attend and negotiate not only on behalf of Barbados, on behalf of the Caribbean, on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States, this grouping of 40 countries. And that's how I started. I'm really glad that I took that step some 20 odd years ago, more than 20 years ago.
Can we pause on the question of the developing island nations for a few minutes? You mentioned that they face an existential threat. Is it a different kind of threat than the globe in general is facing, or is it a question of magnitude?
No, it is a different threat. The reality is that you have small island developing states all over the world. So you have these tiny atoll nations in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, etc. In many instances, these countries are a few meters, a meter or so above sea level. So as sea levels rise, and the census is telling us that sea levels are rising, and the rate of increase of sea level rise is increasing every decade over the course of the last, I would say 100 years or so. And so sea level rise represents a significant threat to those atoll islands, many of whom are just a few meters above sea level. We're also seeing increased frequency of extreme weather events. So if you're a small island developing state in the Caribbean, you're seeing more frequent and stronger storms. Now, and the reality is that if you're a small island state, one hurricane can, given your small size, that affects your entire island. And one hurricane can, just in a few hours, wipe away decades of development gains. We've had instances over the course of the last few years where hurricanes in Dominica, in 2019 in the Bahamas, in 2017, we had an extremely violent hurricane season in the Caribbean, where Dominica, we had St. Martin, I think Puerto Rico as well, was also impacted. And what you saw from those hurricanes, which is completely different from, say, a hurricane hitting the continental United States, is that you know, if a hurricane hits Florida, if it probably hits a few towns, it hits Miami, but Tallahassee is probably spared, or Fort Lauderdale, and economic activity can continue to take place in New York, in South Carolina, in California, on the West Coast, etc. However, when a small island developing state is struck by a climate event or extreme weather event, it shuts down the economy in many instances for weeks and potentially months. So the nature of the threat is completely different. These countries are very exposed. They will be the first to experience, and they are the first already experiencing, you know, some of the major impacts of the climate crisis. And this is why it has always been a fight for their survival. You know, their participation in international climate negotiations was just not about staking out positions or to seek economic gain or because of broader geopolitical interests. It has always been about survival. And it was, you know, everyone hears about the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, which was a part of the Paris Agreement in 2015. It was a small island developing states that put that goal on the table way back in 2008. Now, if the world had taken notice, if they had been, you know, if the larger countries had rallied around this goal way back in 2008, rather than wait until 2015 in Paris, I think that we would have been a lot further in terms of the global response to the climate crisis. So, small island developing states, they've played, not because I'm from one, but they've played really an important role in driving global ambition around the climate crisis.
Thank you. The nature of the work that you're doing now, however, is rather different than the kind of advocacy that you might have done as a part of the mission of Barbados or as a leader among missions. Can you tell us a little bit about your current role, starting with whether your title, Special Advisor to the Secretary General and Assistant Secretary General, do they have you doing two jobs, or is that one job?
No,
or is it 10
it
jobs?
Is one job. Very good question. It is one job, and the role of Assistant Secretary General is a predefined role in the UN system. So I'm pegged as an Assistant Secretary General. But my substantive work is on leading the Secretary General's climate team and serving as his special advisor on climate action. And in that role, really, it is to advise one of the most important and principal voices in the world on climate action. And the Secretary General is uniquely poised. He can convene. He can convene leaders, given that he is the chief executive of this intergovernmental body. He can convene countries. He can convene leaders, but not only political leaders, but leaders from governments, leaders from business, from financial institutions, civil society, young people, etc. And as a Secretary General, he also needs to play the role of truth teller and honest broker. Multilateralism survives when countries are able to agree on compromises, but principal compromises that that deliver on the complex challenges that international community faces. So my role is simply to support him. He is a very vocal voice on the need for ambition on climate change. He's been a very vocal voice on calling for ambition on all fronts, on efforts to reduce emissions, which we call mitigating climate change, ambition on protecting people and livelihoods. We call that adaptation, but also ambition on finance, because finance is that enabler of greater ambition on mitigation and on adaptation. So our role really, and the role of the excellent team and colleagues you met, Ezra, really is to support his work, support his advocacy, and also to work with countries, work with other stakeholders, really in ensuring that we can solve this climate crisis.
Do you, I guess I'm asking you to speak first for yourself and second, a bit institutionally, do you view climate change primarily as a scientific and technological challenge, or is it really mostly a political and economics problem? Or is that question unfair? Because I'm
yeah. I think it's an unfair. No. I think it's all of the above, but the solutions are political, right?
Yeah.
Right? And the science is crystal clear. The science is crystal clear, and we saw this in the most recent reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We know we have a problem, right? Greenhouse gas emissions are at record levels,
And here you're talking CO2.
CO2
Comes from automobiles and
yeah,
industry.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And we know that fossil fuels are the primary cause of carbon pollution. So coal, oil, gas, main drivers of the climate crisis. So the science is absolutely clear, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've been producing these reports for the last 3.5 decades. And in the early years, many, primarily from the oil and gas industry, cast doubt on the validity of the science, similar to what was done with cigarettes, right? With smoking, where the powerful tobacco companies and lobbyists try to cast aspersions,
suppress and discredit,
discredit and suppress the science and the links between smoking and cancer. But the science is clear, and the science is also clear in terms of what we need to do to reduce global emissions. We need to get out of fossil fuels, get out of coal as quickly as possible, and significantly phase down and phase out use of oil and gas over time. So on the science, and the reality is that we have the technologies. Renewable energy technologies have declined. The cost has declined by about 85% over the course of the last decade.
And you're talking wind power,
wind, solar PV, and battery storage. Those technologies have declined by about 85% over the course of the last decade. Mm-hmm. And in most major economies, these renewable energy technologies are cheaper and more cost competitive than coal and other fossil fuels. So there are no doubts about the science. There are no doubts about the technological solutions. The problem is political will. And it's political will, quite frankly, in a small group of countries, a small number of countries. The group of 20, the 20 largest economies in the world, they account for 80% of global emissions. 80%. Just 20 countries account for 80% of global emissions. It is, and fundamentally, it is the actions of these 20 countries and other significant emitters, but primarily these 20 countries, 80% of global emissions, carbon pollution, and about 75 to 80% of the global economy, right? It is these countries that we need to really lead politically in reducing emissions at the scale and pace needed to achieve the global climate goals, right? So it is fundamentally a political problem. Now, in this group of 20 countries, you don't have any of the countries that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, like the small island developing states or the least developed countries or countries in Africa. And fundamentally, that is one of the challenges and really unfair dimensions of the climate crisis. Those countries that have contributed least are the ones that are being affected most. Those are the ones that will be affected first, and they're the ones that will be affected the worst. One of the most depressing findings, I should use that word, from one of the recently released IPCC reports was that if you're living in South America or Central America, Central, East or West Africa, South Asia, or a small island developing state, you're 15 times more likely to die from climate impact, 15 times more likely to die from a climate impact. And when you look at the countries that are covered, say Central, South, and East Africa, or the small islands, or Central American countries, these are not countries that are big emitters, right? These are not countries that are among that list of the 20 top emitters globally. So hence, we have this mismatch between what we know on science, the technological options available, and the movement that needs to happen politically.
Can we analyze that political dynamic a little bit? And I'm imagining that it's different from country to country. There will be countries such as the United States, which are have been to a large extent held captive by certain industries. Lots of lobbyists spending lots of money to persuade lots of otherwise intelligent and well-meaning people to ignore the problem. But then in China, they're trying to play catch up and industrialize what was 30 years ago still a primarily rural agricultural society and grow their way into prosperity. Does every country have a different story, or is there a narrative that holds all of them together somehow?
No, all countries. So all countries have a different story. All countries. If you look at the G20 countries, I often say that not all G20 countries are created equally, right? You have countries like the US, Canada, the European Union, Japan, who are developed countries whose development was primarily based on high carbon, right? And
fossil fuel, but also deforestation. I mean,
yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. Right. So these are countries that are huge historical emitters and have the responsibility to lead. This is embedded in the climate convention, where developed countries, historical, the larger historical emitting countries have a responsibility to lead. And when you look at the developing countries as well, fast-growing countries who have an imperative to grow, and quite frankly, the dominant development model at the moment is a high carbon development model. Most of these countries are use coal as the primary fuel for their economies, right? So our challenge is to support finding really creative ways of supporting these countries to exit coal as quickly as possible. One of the things that the IPCC has said is that the single most important thing to do to keep this 1.5-degree goal, the Paris Agreement, alive is ending coal on an accelerated time frame. So 2030 for developed countries, so for the US and the EU, Canada, 2030, and 2040 for the developing countries. And when you look at the global coal pipeline, it's about 94% of that pipeline is centered in the Asia Pacific region. So our challenge over the course of the next few years is to get these countries off of coal as quickly and as fast as possible, but to do it in a way that does not disrupt their development prospects, because no country is going to undermine its own development prospects. Just not. No government is going to do that. The good thing is that many of the alternatives to coal and fossil fuels, the price, as I said, or the cost has declined significantly, right? So the cost of renewable technologies, they've declined by about 85%. Coming out of Glasgow last year, Glasgow was this major climate conference. Every year, governments meet.
These are follow-ups to the Paris.
Yes, yeah. Well, even before Paris, but every year, governments meet under the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention. 2015, they agreed on the Paris Agreement. Last year, it was COP. It's called Conference of the Parties. And the 26th meeting was held in Glasgow. And at that meeting, one of the good outcomes was a decision for countries to eventually, to work on coal, but a clear recognition in line with what the science tells us, that this decade should be the decade where as many countries as possible exit coal. So, so we have a challenge ahead. We have this major challenge ahead of us. We need to get these fast-growing developing countries, who now account for a much greater share of global emissions than they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, right? These countries need to be placed on a different development pathway, but at the same time, the rich countries must accelerate the decarbonization of their economies. The rich countries as well must also help and support the developing countries really to also reduce their emissions and adapt to the climate crisis as well.
Now, the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change involved each of the signatories, and it was 196 countries. A couple countries didn't sign, I suppose, but each of those countries made a pledge of some sort on what its action plan would be. Who at the UN is sort of responsible for the monitoring and the collecting of evidence of whether those pledges are being met?
That's a really great question. So I would say it's a combination of the UN Framework Convention. We don't have a judge at the UN who is going through all of these pledges, or we call them the nationally determined contributions. But as part of the Paris Agreement, there are mechanisms where these commitments are measured, reported, and verified on a periodic basis. So I think it needs a bit more explanation from my side as well. So as part of the Paris Agreement, it was a unique, sort of a unique environmental agreement with a combination of top-down features, but also a bottom-up approach. So the top-down feature was, we as a global community agree to do all that we can to keep the increase in global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was well below, and to pursue best efforts. So that's a top-down feature. However, in an ideal world, then you say, okay, in order to do this, we have a global carbon budget, and we'll just slice it up in a way that is fair and equitable. If we'd done that, I'm sure that we would still be negotiating, what is the US's fair share? What is the fair share of China? What is the fair share of Barbados? What's the fair share of the United Kingdom? So instead, the agreement was that each country would be free to say what they are prepared to do. So that's the bottom-up feature. So every 5 years, a country is supposed to submit what is called a nationally determined contribution, or their national climate target, which would be their interpretation of what their fair share is. unfortunately, the top down and the bottom up don't match, right? Based on what countries have submitted at the end of Glasgow in terms of their national contributions, we would see a 14% increase in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. When the science tells us that if we are to be consistent with this 1.5 degree goal, we need to see a 45% reduction by 2030. So there's a massive difference between a 14% increase, what the nationally determined contributions are pointing to, and what is required by the science. However, internally, as part of the decisions that countries have made as parties to the Paris Agreement, they are encouraged to periodically update these national climate plans or nationally determined contributions. And the Secretary General has been calling on all of them, especially the major emitters, to update them on an annual basis until we can get close to this, to what is required, to the reductions required to keep this 1.5 degree goal alive.
But the agreement originally called for 5-year reporting?
Yeah. So nationally determined contributions are supposed to be submitted every 5 years, but countries can submit their NDCs at any time, right? Right. It does not limit a country from submitting a nationally determined contribution. Right. But it was felt that having a regular cycle, a 5-year cycle would act as a pressuring mechanism, a forcing mechanism, because if a country knows that other countries are also going to if we're on these 5-year cycles, countries can prepare periodically, but we're not on target, and we really need to find really creative ways of ensuring that countries go back to the table and update the ambition level of their national targets.
The Secretary General must find himself in a very difficult position, because the temptation might be to kind of blame and shame countries that are failing to meet their pledges, but by the same token, those are the countries that essentially fund the UN. That paradox, how do you cut through it? How do you make the most of kind of the moral high ground, the voice of the Secretary General, when you really can't call out individual specific countries?
Well, he does call out
by name.
Yeah. Okay. He has called out countries by name. He
that must go very well.
Yeah. But he and he's also called for the leadership of the G20 as well, right? And so he sticks to the science. He does not paper over the urgency of the matter, and he speaks frankly. He has the moral authority, and yes, there will be tensions with member states, but we also have billions and billions of ordinary citizens, right, who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and the support that he's received from civil society has been absolutely great. But in calling out, he's also been very fair, right? He has also been very fair in terms of, addressing issues like the common but differentiated responsibilities, and the fact that not all G20 countries are the same, and that developing countries will also require support. So he has been fair. He's been extremely fair. He's been calling on, for example, 13 years ago, developed countries pledged to provide 100 billion in climate finance annually, and that pledge has not been delivered. So he has been very fair in terms of calling for ambition across the board and calling out those who need to do more, not in an unfair or being selective, but across the board, because it's a very complex issue, and we need progress on multiple fronts. And while on some issues countries might be leading, they might be laggards on other issues as well.
Right.
So
are
he's
there some countries that have been exemplary in meeting their Paris pledges?
Well, quite frankly, all countries can do more. All countries can do more.
And I was kind of hoping, because the Netherlands, they're really
all countries can do more on reducing their emissions. We also need developed countries to do more in terms of the climate finance and financial assistance that they provide to the developing world as well. So it's hard to identify a star pupil from the constellation of parties to the Paris Agreement.
Right. I'd like to turn for a few minutes to the recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report earlier this month. It was titled "Climate Change 2022: Mitigation of Climate Change," and you introduced the term mitigation into our discussion just a few minutes ago. And I looked it up in the dictionary because I'm a professor, and if I don't know exactly what a word means, for those of you keeping score at home, I do look things up in the dictionary. And there were three definitions offered. The first was avoidance, avoiding the bad thing that might happen. The second definition was minimization, trying to make the bad thing as limited as possible. And the third definition was compensatory, which is to say, after the bad thing has happened, trying to make it right to the people who were affected by that bad thing. Is this report, which by the way I have not read because it's 3,000 pages long and extremely technical, and I'm just a dumb philosophy professor, so it made very little sense to me. But what does the UN in this IPCC report actually mean by mitigation? Are they still focused on avoiding? Are they now more focused on minimizing the impact of climate change, or are we past that point and up to a compensatory perspective?
So the report that you refer to is part 3 of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC.
So always the middle part of a trilogy is the best one. So we should talk about that one instead.
Yeah. So we had 2 previous reports, one that dealt with the physical science, like where are we generally on climate, one a few weeks ago that dealt with the with impacts and vulnerability, and that stat that I gave earlier on, if you're living in certain parts of, in these global hotspots, you're 15 times more likely. That came from that report. And this third one dealt with the mitigation aspect, the efforts to reduce emissions, right? Whether it's through avoidance, minimization, or total elimination of emissions. And in the climate world, mitigation is about efforts to reduce emissions, be it through the uptake of renewable energy? Is it through carbon dioxide removal technologies, land use policy and change, afforestation, etc.? So this report, the mitigation report, looked at trends in global emissions, trends in global greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, methane, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was what this report was focused on. And some of the main findings are that, as I said earlier, we're way off target from meeting our collective global climate goals. Global emissions continue to rise. But it also indicated that there are, at present, cost-effective solutions that can help us to solve this problem. So,
in other words, it's not too late, but it
is not too late. It's definitely not too late. Yeah.
Too late is coming sooner than we would want it to come.
Yeah. It is not too late, but we're close to. One of the quotes that I saw was that we're at that now or never moment. Right.
The 5 minutes till midnight moment.
Exactly. 5 minutes to midnight, the last 15 minutes of a football soccer game, and you're 3 or 4 goals behind. It's still possible, but it will require an incredible effort. And that's basically what this report says, that we chances are that when the next full assessment report of the IPCC is done in the next 5 or 6 years, if there's not a serious effort to reduce global emissions, it might be too late to keep this 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement alive. And that has severe implications for lives and livelihoods.
I have so many more questions that I would like to ask you, but that would be unfair to a very patient participant. So I'm going to ask Diana to weigh in here, either reading questions, if you like, from the chat, or calling on people as you see fit.
Thank you, Jason. So we have quite a few questions. I'm going to try and combine them as they relate to similar points. So the first question that's come up, Ambassador, is the continued warning from the IPCC report that warns us of the dangers and calls for action. But is the response proportionate in terms of scale, scope, and urgency, and particularly as it relates to governments and businesses? There is a continued reliance on consumption and growth, particularly in the developed world, quote unquote. But also a question has come up that asks about the reliance and the politics around oil. And can we trust our governments? Can citizens really trust their governments to take the right action in terms of climate change that's needed?
Thanks. So in response to that question, the reality is that we're not moving fast enough, right? The actions that have been taken are not matched by the pace and scale in terms of what we need to do to reduce emissions. And the reality is that in the United States and globally, the oil and gas industry, one of the best organized lobbying groups ever in the history of this, really well organized. And we've seen it with the Ukraine situation, where they're very well organized. They were also very well organized in terms of pushing back against climate legislation in the United States for many decades. So how we break this logjam? I wish I had a solution. Maybe a technological breakthrough. If we're able to have a significant technological breakthrough, maybe on battery storage. It could mean an abrupt transition. I wish I could answer this question much better, but we're not seeing the type of action at the pace and scale that is required. In countries, like most countries in the EU, there is a political consensus that climate change is real. There's a political consensus on the urgency of taking action. And we've seen really good progress in those countries. But the EU's share of global emissions is shrinking. And even if the EU were to have the most ambitious climate targets, and if they were to achieve those ambitious climate targets, if they were to achieve them and overachieve them, we would still not solve the problem, because we need more action in some of the larger economies as well. So, I wish I could answer the question better. And I also wish that I could be more hopeful. But this is why we need ordinary citizens, students and ordinary citizens, your investors, your voters, your consumers, and you're also individuals as well. And but we're not seeing action at the pace and scale that is needed.
Yeah. Well, we have a considerable number of students and faculty who have really demonstrated commitment to sustainability and are looking at solutions. In fact, we have some student groups who are engaged in research in this area on climate action. And I noticed in the questions that we have a few participants who are asking about those solutions. What has come up as viable solutions? Have the reports shared suggestions of best practices? One of our participants suggested nuclear fusion, and that it has a very safe reaction, can result in 4 million times the energy as burned from coal. On the other side, there are also some concerns about the solutions, as Professor Farias mentioned, looking to batteries as an option. Could that just be kicking the can down the road in terms of dealing with lithium, toxicity from disposal of that waste? So these are questions that our participants are concerned about. What kinds of solutions can they look to? Can we all look to? And are they completely safe, and or are we just kind of balancing our options and choosing the least worst choice?
Yeah. So for the report of the IPCC, the most recent one, it offers quite a long menu of potential options, some of which are low-hanging fruit, like, for example, renewable energy uptake. And yes, it's not perfect in terms of lithium, but the reality is, if we continue to use coal, coal is not only polluting and bad for the climate, but there are many significant health challenges associated with coal use. Drilling for oil and gas, it releases methane, and we know that methane is it's a short-lived, but it's many times more challenging in terms of heat trapping than CO2. So, and with nuclear, we know that nuclear waste has this very long life cycle. So there isn't a perfect solution, but the reality is we have, wind, solar, batteries, renewable energy offers us the best option to get away from this addiction to coal. The report also looks at carbon dioxide removal technologies as well. It says that this must be an option moving into the future. And then some of those technologies, we also need to look at the potential risks associated with some of those technologies. Some like, planting more trees, that's pretty easy to do. But others like carbon capture and storage, there are some issues that must be addressed in terms of the cost effectiveness, but also the safety of some of these technologies. And the report also looks at lifestyle changes, right? Lifestyle changes, public transportation, we turn on the thermostat sometimes during winter, and ensuring that cities are more conducive for walking and biking. And there are many lifestyle changes that can be taken that can help us really, that ordinary individuals can take. In fact, the UN has this website and this program, Ezra, is called the Act Now initiative. If you go on the UN website or you Google Act Now initiative, they offer a number of individual actions, 10 individual actions that can be taken really as your own contribution to the climate crisis. Walking, biking, the sort of diet that you have, all individual choices that can make a contribution. So for me, the risk of breaching this 1.5 degree goal, right? And we know that many of the changes, scientists already said, many of the changes will be irreversible. This is the real risk. This is the real risk, and we know that fossil fuels will get us over. We need to get off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. So, if there's one message that I would love to impart this evening is we really need all of you really to be strong advocates for the most ambitious climate action. As individuals, as voters, as investors, as consumers, because it will require all hands on deck. It will require all hands on deck, and all individual actions matter, and every degree of warming matters as well. So what little we can do will definitely help us to solve this problem.
Yes. I'd like to, thank you. I'd like to invite Professor Farias to ask the next question.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, sir, for your very honest and open conversation today. My question, one of the entities or sources of greenhouse gas emissions that does not seem to make the news is the militaries of the world. And somewhere I saw a statistic that about 6% of the world's greenhouse gases come from militaries, even in peacetime. And isn't that, I was just wondering what your comments on that are and how they might be addressed.
Well, I don't, I can't comment on the stack. I would need to check it, but it shows really that we really need to do as much as possible to green militaries. And I know that there was, heading into COP26, an effort underway to do this. But from the UN's perspective, the UN has its peacekeeping operations has extensive peacekeeping operations around the world, and this is something that is being looked at as well. How to reduce the carbon footprint of peacekeeping operations and the UN's carbon footprint generally. But the point that you made about militaries in general is it's a good one and something that we will definitely look at as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think, yes, we have 2 more questions I'll try to combine. Our participants are interested in knowing, and I will actually share with the group that excellent website, Ambassador, that Act Now. I have seen it, so I'll share that reference with the group. Oh, thank you. Esther just put it in the chat, everyone. Wonderful. But looking at that, hopefully we can get some many good and excellent ideas. I wonder if you have seen or heard of any best practices, any examples, particularly at the local level. And I think this one participant had asked about small steps. What could we do to hold our local politicians accountable and to make change at the local level? And looking at these recommendations could be one step, but I wonder if you have heard or seen any best practices or examples of success on the local level.
That's a fantastic question, and so much of the good news, there's not a lot of good news on climate, but so much of the good news on climate is occurring at the local level, right? Where city governments around the world are coming together to find really creative solutions to the climate crisis across the world in both developed and developing countries. So in Bogota, where you're seeing the electrification of buses, to multiple cities, even in New York City. Michael Bloomberg, who is a special envoy for the SG, boasts significant, always boasts about the steps that he was able to take when he was mayor to encourage biking. We're also seeing innovations in public transport in both developed and developing countries, green and more energy efficient buildings. So most of, quite a number of the innovations and best practices globally that we're seeing are occurring in cities and local jurisdictions. And in many instances, in the absence of ambitious climate policies at the national or federal levels. Really good question. This is where the innovation happens. This is where the real action happens. And maybe as we head into the future and we work very closely with cities, we work very closely with local authorities that across various networks, including the C40 network, which is a group of cities, that this is going to be the way to go, where we focus a lot of our effort. Cities don't have votes at the UN, but we work really closely with them to mobilize them and amplify their voices. And this is something that the Secretary General has and will continue to do.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that brings us up to the end of our time together. Based on the questions in the chat, I think we could easily go for another hour. But to make these forums sustainable, we do need to keep them on schedule. So again, thank you so much, Mr. Hart, for joining us this evening, sharing your experience and wisdom, as much optimism as you could muster, and also the realism as well that all of us need to take on board.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
And this actually concludes our UN NGO Pathways Forum program for the spring semester of 2022. Try not to miss us too much, but we will be back in the fall semester with another schedule of great guests and conversations. So thank you all for joining us.